forgotten men and women of the United States are forgotten no more. You're the great people. You're the great people. You work hard, you pay your taxes, you do all these things, and you were forgotten. They forgot about you. And you're the smartest people. You're the smartest people. You know, when they talk about the elite. The elite. Do you ever see the elite? They're not elite. You're the elite. You are the elite.
That was President Trump in Ohio last night telling us what he thinks about the elite. You're the elite. You'll hear what I think in a moment, and also what Tammy Bruce thinks, who I'm delighted to say is with us for the whole hour tonight. There she is. Evening, everyone, and welcome to The Next Revolution. I'm Steve Hilton, and this is the home of positive populism. We'll be talking about immigration and the wall, a new plan to make Congress more accountable, and we'll bring you part 2 of our blockbuster Swamp Watch on China's corrupt influence operations in Washington, D.C. But first, back to those elites. For me, the most important term is not actually the elite. You can be part of the elite and still be on the side of the people. But elitism. Elitism is an ideology that prioritizes the interests of those at the top. And it's been the dominant ideology in American politics for the last few decades. A big part of elitism is globalism. The idea that we should put some vague notion of the global interest ahead of the national interest. Now, there was a story this week that is a perfect encapsulation of elitist globalist thinking. And I want to start with it tonight. It was reported that tech giant Google is working with the Chinese government to develop a search engine that implements the regime's censorship of information it doesn't like. This is part of Google's plan to get back into China after it pulled out in 2010 in protest at the Chinese government's hacking of Gmail. This story is very personal for me. The China part is personal because my parents are Hungarian. I know all about oppressive communist regimes, and believe me, that's what today's China is. The Google part is personal because my wife once worked there, and we now have a very comfortable life as a result. Some of Google's top executives are close friends. But you know me by now, when I think something is wrong, I'll say so, whomever it may offend. And this is not just wrong, it's shameful. Of course, it's not the whole story about Google. I use Google all the time. I'm sure you do too. It's important to be fair and reasonable. Google's products are useful, and that's why it's grown so big. But it's because it got so big that Google is now not just useful, but dangerous too. It is a leading force for elitism and globalism. It's the essence of globalism that businesses have no loyalty to their home country. For more than most corporations, America really is Google's home. Did you know that Google got started thanks to a program run by the US government? Google wouldn't exist if it wasn't for American taxpayers. Google once said its mission was to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible. Its motto was, "Don't be evil." But now they've floated off in a giant balloon of arrogance, untethered to any notions of loyalty or ethics. Google is helping America's #1 enemy, the evil communist dictatorship in China, to oppress its own people through censorship. Literally the exact opposite of what Google once stood for. Remember too that Google has built an artificial intelligence center in Beijing. Even though the Chinese regime is openly saying it will use artificial intelligence to achieve military and economic dominance over America. On top of that, Google recently pulled out of helping our own Defense Department with artificial intelligence. So Google, born of a US government program, won't work with our government to defend democracy, but is falling over itself to work with the world's worst despots to crush democracy. I know the word treason is thrown around too much these days, but that seems like a pretty good definition of it to me. This is Google's CEO, Sundar Pichai. Someone I know personally. And now I'm talking to you, Sundar, directly. If you go through with this, it will show the world that you no longer believe in your own mission of making information available. You just want to make more money available to you. It will expose all those sanctimonious, high-minded tweets and statements about human rights and standing up for values as pure BS. It will confirm that Google is driven by one thing: maximizing GCP, greed, control, power. Of course, you wouldn't come on this show to defend yourself, and I know why. Partly, you just refuse to be accountable. But there's a worse reason. China told you not to talk about this. You're not only working with the communist dictators to censor in China, you're doing their bidding by censoring yourself in America. If you go ahead with this, I will come after you with everything I've got, and I won't be the only one. But there is still time for you to change. Don't do this. Do the right thing. In a phrase, don't be evil. All right, follow us at NextRevFNC and at Steve Hilton X, and let us know what you think. Now let's see what our panel think. In New York, Fox News contributor and president of Independent Women's Voice, Tammy Bruce. And here in Los Angeles, Wisconsin Congressman Mike Gallagher and Hoover Institution Senior Fellow Victor Davis Hanson. What a great team. I want to start with Tammy. What is your take on this whole situation, Google and China?
Well, I love your opening monologue, and this is what's interesting for all of us. Look, as a capitalist, I want individuals and companies to become as big and as wonderful as they possibly can be. But one of the luxuries we get when you become extremely successful, Google is now number 4, the biggest tech company in the world. Fourth, Apple is number 1. And so they're still big enough, right? But you gain a luxury of being able to start to make decisions based on some kind of a moral footing. Now, the world did this when it came to South Africa, as an example. The apartheid regime, of course, was evil and horrible, and the world banded together to isolate South Africa, especially with sports, but of course also financially, to try to move them away from the apartheid regime, and that worked, of course. We're now in a situation where the global argument has been made that there really are no borders in general. And that, I think, has helped facilitate the idea that working with China is no big deal. And I think that part of the argument, of course, for Google internally is, well, we want to be competitive. Look at now, Apple is also in China. Apple, in its iCloud, with its iCloud partner in China, actually works through a Chinese telecom. Now, and of course, in the tech industry, Bloomberg has just reported that China is actually taking active moves to nationalize the entire tech industry there. So you've got Google deciding to try to move in, as China is admittedly nationalizing effectively, controlling, which they do generally everything, certainly with the tech sector, and Google, with whatever they do, in addition to, it's not just the search engine, Steve, it's also a cloud-based server dynamic that they want to move into China as well, which would also be involved with a Chinese partner, which means China would have access to whatever it is that's in data on that server. So it is about facilitating this kind of despot dynamic, a tyranny, and doing so with the imprimatur, if you will, of being an American company and American values. But it's facilitating a tyranny that I think all of us should stand up against.
Right. Well, I love you, Tammy. I love you anyway, but particularly tonight for that comparison with South Africa, because I've been making that comparison. You're the first other person I've heard say that, and I think it's so apt. It's exactly right. Everyone's up in arms. You know, when I was in university, we had boycotts against the apartheid regime, but China seems to be fine. Anyway, Congressman, so I know you're not literally the government, but you're the nearest thing we have to it. Shouldn't this be stopped by our authorities? Should CFIUS get involved? That's the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States. They can block things like this, can't they? Do you think they should?
Well, we just revamped the whole CFIUS process as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, but that primarily looks at Chinese investment in the United States. Let's say, for example, that the Chinese are going to make a massive early-stage investment in an artificial intelligence company here. CFIUS can take a look at that and decide whether or not they want to allow it. Now, this is obviously an American company going to China. I think the experience of other companies dealing with China should be warning enough. For example, the Korean conglomerate Lata owned a bunch of real estate in South Korea where we wanted to put our THAAD missile battery system recently. The Chinese obviously vociferously objected, and in order to coerce Lota, as a result, they shut down something like 122 businesses they owned in China, citing dubious fire safety regulations. This is just one example of the coercive way they use their economic power, what they extract in return for market access. And this should be incredibly troubling because, if anything, since Google pulled out in 2010, citing hacking of Gmail accounts associated with human rights activists in China. The human rights record of the Chinese Communist Party has gotten even worse as General Secretary Xi has consolidated power. It's not just shutting down Google searches for Tiananmen Square. It's also making unavailable certain public health information. We have a recent vaccine scandal that potentially jeopardized the lives of hundreds of thousands of Chinese children. And vaccines is one of the phrases that's being censored right now.
Oh, they're just so outrageous. They're so disgusting. You're right there, as I am, right in the middle of Silicon Valley at the Hoover Institution. You're in the thick of the tech world. How do you see China's influence in the tech sector, and what do you think of this story?
Well, we know that China leapfrogged over 50 years of rough development that most countries have to go through by technological theft. So we got 350,000 Chinese nationals in the United States. We just arrested Jimmy Lee, who was a CIA operative and gave away all of our assets in China. So we know what they do. The question
Can you just explain that a bit more? What
he was a ex-CIA operative who was based in Beijing, who was arrested, I think, 2 months ago.
Right.
And we learned that the reason that 20 or so of our key assets in China were either executed or imprisoned because he gave the names of them to the Beijing government. He was a U.S. citizen of Chinese background. Well, we know what China's doing, and we know what Google does because they can get away with it. But why are these companies abusing the rights of human rights or free speech, whether it's Facebook blocking ads? And I think what it's the core of the problem is that in a very brilliant fashion, they threaded the needle between left and right. They said to the right, you guys are Milton Friedman, open market people. You don't believe in antitrust legislation. You just let us get bigger, we'll make more money, and the market will adjudicate morality. Then they turned over to the left and said, we're not J.P. Morgan, we're not John D. Rockefeller. Look at us. We wear black, we're cool, we wear flip-flops, we have $3 trillion in assets, and we give money. 90% of all of our campaign donations go to the left. And so we have not been able to come together.
We've got some names. Google throws a lot of money around.
Yeah, absolutely, but we can't get anybody to say you're subject just like anybody else to monopoly questions, antitrust, product liability, patriotism, human rights, because each side has their own vested interest in letting them get away with it. And they look so cool, they look so hip.
Well, it's not very cool to censor and to work with this appalling regime. And I thank you for all your thoughts on that. We've got to move on, but I think that, as I said, if they go through with this, I think it will be a disaster for them, for their reputation, for the whole Silicon Valley's reputation. And I think that it will actually alert people to some of the points that you've all been making. All right, last week Swamp Watch took on China's meddling in our democracy, and the response was overwhelming. Tonight in part 2, we expose even more corruption. And up next, President Trump says there could be a government shutdown if the border wall isn't funded. Will Congress give in? Don't go away.
We're going to start to get very nasty over the wall. We're either getting it or we're closing down government. We need border security.
That was President Trump earlier this week, continuing to stand by his threat of a government shutdown before the midterm elections to force Congress's hand into funding the wall. Tammy, can I just come to you on this first? I've heard a lot of people in the last few days saying, look, the president, supporters of President Trump saying, look, honestly, just shut up about the wall and the immigration, all the rest of it. Focus on the economy. That's the good thing to do. Just keep talking about that. What do you think?
Well, Gallup has a poll that they do on the most, and they ask a question each month about the most important problem that Americans think that we're facing. And last month it was immigration, and then poor leadership in government, and then the economy. And of course, the president's had some terrific success with the economy, and it goes back to the Reagan question, of course, that matters to all Americans because it feeds into whether or not we have a future and what your children's lives are going to be like, which is, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And that speaks, though, to a whole range of issues, but the economy is right there. That speaks to the level of freedom that we have. But the fact that that immigration is a top issue, and it's not because people think that our borders aren't open enough, but within the conversation that has come since the campaign and through President Trump's administration, there's a realization of the level of danger that this presents, the impact not just with safety, but national security and with the economy and with the nature of how strong we are in general in the world, in a world that is clearly still dealing with problems left over from the last 8 years of non-governments, effectively. So the economy is clearly important, but this is also a promise he made. He was elected not because of slogans, but because of policies, the policy about the economy, about taxes, but primarily it was also about the wall that speaks to all of those issues that matter to us. And remember now, there is one slogan, it's promises made, promises kept. And the wall speaks to all of that. And also, when you think about what matters to in the midterms, it's those three issues. It is immigration, it is about leadership. And this is why he's strong in saying that he might want to shut down the government. People want action, but not just any action.
Yes.
Action on the promises that are made that speak to what improves our lives. The president owns those issues. By the way, Russia, when it comes to concern about Russia, doesn't even register on the Gallup poll. It gets an asterisk.
Exactly.
So those issues that the left is moving don't matter. The president's issues do, and immigration's at the top.
Right, so Victor, I'd love your sort of academic perspective on this question of the promise, because, he made the promise, and I completely agree with Tammy. It was probably the most well-known of all of them. There was that, train the swamp, the economy, but this build the wall was so central. Yeah. He made the promise, but he needs Congress to deliver it. What's the sort of democratic constitutional way of thinking about this?
Well, he's in an election that's 50-50, his chances of keeping the House, and he needs a signature galvanizing issue, and immigration is the one signature issue that he hasn't delivered on, at least formally. And so but he doesn't have the votes. Even with his Republican Party, he doesn't have the votes to build a wall. He also knows that if you shut down the government, the people who propose that idea get blamed right before the midterm. His own people don't want him to do that. So he's got to somehow square that circle to get people energized to come out to put him over the top.
Don't you think that if it doesn't happen, that it just further undermines people's faith in democracy? Well, this big promise made and just nothing
I think
happened.
that 4 out of 5 people will vote for him that voted for him in 2016 and turn out. But he needs 5 out of 5. He needs every vote.
Right.
So he needs to get them all on board. And I think one of the things he might do is say, you know what, we can't quite do the wall right now. He doesn't have to say that, but he can't quite do it because he doesn't have the votes. But maybe if he did an executive order and said, you know what, anybody in the United States who is here illegally, whether residing in the United States illegally, cannot send money back to a foreign country without a 10% tax on it. So we're sending $30 billion to Mexico in remittances and $30 billion to Central America. Much of that are from people here who are not only some of them on public assistance, but here illegally. That would raise about $5 billion a year, and said until
we can for the wall.
Yes, and use that for the wall and bank it and say that to everybody.
What do you think of that?
I think that's a good idea. Might have to explore the details of it, but Victor usually
you should go and do a bill on it right now.
But I do have a crazy idea. Rather than lurching to a shutdown, why not allow members of Congress to go home to campaign for all of August and potentially all of October leading up to the election, knowing that these issues remain unresolved? It's absolutely absurd because people in D.C. confuse campaigning with legislating. We need more legislating, and if you do your job, your voters will reward you for it. Instead, people don't want to do their job. They just want to go home, they want to raise money, they want to blame someone else. Keep us there, lock us on the House and the Senate floor, and have the debate.
We'll talk about that. You got an interesting idea on that. But last word to you, Tammy. I mean, it seems to me that it's yet another example of these empty words. I remember Paul Ryan. I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, maybe more, was all, we got to build the wall. He made a video of himself in a helicopter flying over the wall saying we're going to build the wall. There seems to be absolutely no energy from Republicans in Congress to help the president deliver his promise.
Well, that's been the big problem. That's why this is an interesting message as we go into the midterms, that this is like part 2 of the Trump Reformation. That if you really want this to happen and to work, he's got to get his people in there. And you look, they promised the wall just like they promised to repeal and replace Obamacare. So this is why there's such a low approval rating of Congress, that they've lied to us for votes. They took our money based on certain lies, and people want clearly what the president has promised. So part of his rhetoric here, remember, everything's a negotiation. His rhetoric about shutting the government down perhaps is a message, of course, to Mr. McConnell, to Leader McConnell, and of course Paul Ryan is a lame duck. He's moving out. But if we have the House and you've got someone like Jim Jordan, who is the Speaker of the House, things could change in that regard. But yeah, all of this is it's both political and it also is sending messages to Congress about what the president's willing to do. He won the shutdown, if you will, last time when it was about DACA and all of that. There's a sense that can be accomplished again. But bottom line is he wants results versus this kind of politicking. And if anyone can get it, it's him.
There you are. Well, let's see. For the reasons we've all just been discussing, everyone is sick of Congress, but can anything be done to make it work? Our guest, Congressman Mike Gallagher, he's got a new plan to do exactly that. He'll tell us what it is after the break. Welcome back, everyone. A key focus of positive populism is reforming government and politics so the people's interests come first and not those of the big donors and the insiders with the right connections. A new bipartisan effort to do that is the Go to Washington, Go to Work Act of 2018. The measure was introduced by two congressmen, Democrat Rick Nolan of Minnesota and our guest tonight, Republican Mike Gallagher. So, tell us all about it.
It's a simple idea. On this show, Steve, you've obviously been instrumental in exposing the way in which money fuels the swamp in Washington, D.C., and special interests wield a lot of money. But I actually think there's a more simple and more insidious way in which money fuels corruption, and it's that the constant demands of fundraising are such that it crowds out all the time you need to actually do the job of legislating.
You literally mean that there's members of Congress spend so much time raising money.
Yeah, I think that's the bigger problem.
They can't do any work.
I think that's the bigger problem.
Give us a sense of the amount of time. You know, what's that?
It varies from member to member. I would venture to say most members spend upwards of 50% of their time raising money. And so this is a simple bill that would say while Congress
they're
is
in Washington, supposed to be working.
Yeah, that you couldn't raise money. You couldn't run across the street to go call for 3 hours while you should be showing up to your committee assignment, listening to the testimony of the witnesses. Just do an experiment. Turn on C-SPAN. Particularly if you're having trouble sleeping. Turn on C-SPAN.
Right.
And you'll see someone giving a speech to an empty House chamber because it's all theater. It's performance art. It's kabuki theater. And then they'll go across the street and raise money. And I listen, I know I'm new. I know this probably sounds incredibly naive to people far smarter than me like Victor. But at the end of the day, the demands of fundraising grow ever more onerous and they crowd out the time you need to actually try and legislate and get stuff done, which is a difficult endeavor.
So let's just be really clear with the audience. So your bill will actually make it, illegal for members of Congress to raise money while they're
while Congress is in session. So we're not saying you can't raise money, but while Congress is in session.
Well, what do you think?
Well, I mean, 94% of congressional representatives are incumbent. I mean, incumbents get reelected. So in theory, it's good. But let me play devil's advocate.
Sure.
So if I'm going to object to this, I'm going to say, well, maybe they just don't raise money. They get constituents who say, do you know about this issue? And they get informed. Second, so they have challengers. And so in your bill, as I understand it, the challengers would also be restricted from this, the days incumbents could not campaign, challengers couldn't. But time is money.
Yeah.
And under Citizens United, the Supreme Court's already said the federal government can't go in and tell you how to spend your money. So for a person who's not in Congress, the government was going to be telling a challenger, say a businessman who wants to run for Congress, by the way, on this day you can campaign and on this day you can't. I don't think that's going to be constitutional.
All right, well, hang on. Hold the response for a second. Let's see what Tammy's got to think.
Well, that was one of my main issues as well, is that the bill it tells people who are challengers that they can't raise money. One of the biggest problems, of course, is the money differential, is that incumbents have these gigantic war chests, and newbies coming in have not a lot of anything, and they really do have to fundraise. So here you've got someone who might have millions of dollars in a war chest, and some new person wanting to come up, and they've got to really raise money every day and even be, remotely competitive. And so that alone becomes problematic. I would suggest maybe a good way to start, and I think this is a great conversation, but another way to start is they're already only working 2 or 3 days a week. maybe if it's about going to work, maybe we need to make them work like the average American does, at least 5 days a week.
Yeah.
And then instead of month-long vacations, maybe it's a 2 to 3 weeks vacation a year. So they would be working, and they can continue to raise money, but they need to be, and frankly, a lot of people think that Congress working and passing legislation is not a good idea, that we need to pass less, but it needs to be better. So let's not mistake volume with quality.
So I agree emphatically with what Tammy said. That's why I also have a piece of legislation called the Do Your Job Act, which would prohibit Congress from going into recess while we have not restored regular order, not done our job of actually passing appropriations bills, because you get into the situation, which we're in again right now, where people are able to hold, for example, the Defense Department budget hostage to other priorities, and we wait until the last second and we wind up in continuing resolutions that do enormous damage to our military. So I do think that that is a separate and important piece of legislation. On the Citizens United concerns, I mean, we do place limits on our ability to fundraise right now, right? So your ability to give to me is capped at $2,700, so that's a limit. My ability to ask you for money is capped geographically. I can't do it from my office in Washington, D.C. So I'm interested in any idea that just forces members of Congress to spend more time. I'm even open to an amendment that would get at that, the issue of a challenger not being as restricted, because I do think that's actually a very real problem. Yeah. The incumbent reelection rate is actually higher than turnover in some European monarchies, and so that is a real issue.
Yeah, I would just say that people in general hate Congress, 11% in some polls, but they like their individual congressman. That's why 94% of them keep getting elected. So when they go out and schmooze, the people who meet them and talk to them, I was just with a congressman the other day, they love them. They talk to them, they learn from them. And so the congressman thinks he's working harder out in Fresno, where I'm from, out in Fresno, than he is in Washington. Right. So it's going to be very hard to tell the constituents. What? That guy who's driving all over Fresno County and meeting this Farm Bureau group and this labor group, he's really goofing off and just raising money. He may be, but it's going to be a hard sell.
Well, I think Tammy had the crucial point on that, which is, you know, quality, not quantity. Sure. But last word to you, Mike. I just wanted to ask you, you know, we've talked about this stuff a lot, and it seems to me you're really at the forefront of trying to do something about all these frustrations that people have and the way that Congress is broken and politics are broken. Are you a lonely voice? Do you feel you have allies? Is anything going to happen?
I don't have a lot of friends. I would say no. I actually sense there is a shared commitment to reform among the newer members of Congress, and it's on both sides of the aisle. I wrote an op-ed on reform with a Democrat from Silicon Valley, Ro Khanna, who I will never agree with on the role of the federal government in our healthcare system, but we had some similar overlap when it came to reform ideas. And there is a movement bubbling up right now of people saying, listen, business as usual in Washington, D.C. does not seem to be working out well for either party, and certainly not for the American people. So how do we change it? How do we change the process? So even if we get the best people in Congress, if they meet the buzzsaw of a broken process, they're not going to be able to get anything done. Yeah. So I sense there is something changing.
Okay, good. And again, reminds me of something else Tammy said, which is just get new people in who support this more populist agenda, and then things really might start to change. All right, coming up, our Swamp Watch on China last week drew an overwhelming response. So we have more outrageous revelations for you after the break. Last week's Swamp Watch on China got you really fired up. Well, there is a lot more where that came from. We've barely scratched the surface of China's corrupt takeover of our ruling elite. China, Part 2, is this week's Swamp Watch. Last week we told you about lobbying firms hired by Chinese state-owned or government-backed businesses and organizations to push their interests in Washington, D.C. But to really understand the swampiness in all its glory, you need to know the names behind these lobbying firms, the actual... We told you last week that the Chinese state-owned company Sinopec Group hired Cowen Strategies to fix meetings with members of Congress. Who's behind Cowen Strategies? Someone called Mark Cowen. From 1990 to 92, he worked as a commissioner in the Department of Labor. In 1993, he joined the CIA, working there for 7 years, before deciding to cash in on his experience and contacts by becoming a lobbyist. He worked at 4 different firms, including a 12-year stint at Patton Boggs, which would later become the infamous Squire Patton Boggs. And since 2013, he's been running his own lobbying outfit, Cowen Strategies. We also told you about Capital Counsel, which has earned $100,000 so far this year on a contract with the China-US Exchange Foundation, or CUSEF, an organization working to promote Chinese interests both by hiring lobbyists and as legislative director for Republican Congressman Ander Crenshaw, a member of the powerful House Appropriations Committee. Or was it because of Aaron Cohen, who worked as a policy advisor and then chief of staff to disgraced former GOP Senator John Ensign? Perhaps it was Capitol Council's Bob Brooks that sealed the deal. He was chief of staff to former Republican Congressman Jim McCreary, a member of the influential House Ways and Means Committee. But wait, Capitol Council offers insider connections even better than Congressman Jim McCreary's chief of staff. They now offer the services of Congressman McCreary. You've got to hand it to Capitol Council. Why stop at the monkey when you can hire the organ grinder? But it turns out that McCreary isn't the only representative of the American people who cashed out to work for the interests of America's top enemy. Former Arizona Congressman Matt Salmon chaired the Asia and Pacific Subcommittee on the House Foreign Relations Committee before leaving Congress to become Vice President of Government Affairs at Arizona State University. Arizona State is home to a Confucius Institute, an enterprise funded by China to push its agenda on American campuses. In response to critics of the institute, Salmon argued the United States should work with China, not against them. But they are working against us, and Congressman Salmon is helping them. Perhaps the single biggest help China got from America in recent years was its entry into the World Trading System and being awarded Most Favored Nation trading status. Guess who was one of the leading advocates for that in Congress at the time? You know him well. It was good old John Boehner. When the US was approaching a debt ceiling, Boehner even argued that we ought to prioritize our debts to China over paying US troops. So, after all that hard work sucking up to China in Congress, guess where Speaker Boehner ended up after leaving Congress? At swampy Squire Patton Boggs, which lobbies for the Chinese embassy in Washington. I've said it before and I'll say it again tonight. What the hell does a foreign government need lobbyists for? Isn't that the whole point of ambassadors and embassies, to represent a country's interests? The only conclusion we can draw is that the swamp is more powerful than government. China knows it can accomplish more through lobbying than diplomacy. But that only works because our elected officials allow it to work, because they agree to meet with all these foreign government lobbyists. So the real question is, who is meeting with them and what are they discussing? We called 30 members of Congress in both parties and both houses and asked a simple question. Have you ever met with a lobbyist representing the Chinese government, a Chinese state-owned enterprise, or a non-profit organization promoting Chinese interests? Every single one refused to answer. And the outrageous thing about that is there's no requirement for them to answer or to be transparent about this. They're your representatives, paid with your money to represent your interests, and yet there is absolutely zero requirement for them to disclose which lobbyists they're meeting with and what they're discussing. By the way, here are some of the things they do have to disclose: their financial assets and personal income, positions with non-governmental organizations, campaign donations, travel expenses, legal expenses, gifts, staff salaries, and office expenditures. They're required by law to disclose how many Keurig coffee cups or paper clips they buy, but they're not required to disclose the lobbyists they meet with who are pushing the interests of a hostile foreign power that hacks our infrastructure, steals our technology, spies on our intelligence, names their dictator president for life, and has a publicly stated aim of world domination. China is the #1 enemy of the United States. It is outrageous that we allow them to undermine our democracy by infiltrating the swamp and manipulating our leaders. We will keep exposing them here on Swamp Watch until someone does something about it. When will someone do something about it? I'm looking at you because you're there. Sorry, you're the target of all the rage.
Fine. I confess to consuming a lot of Keurig coffee cups on any given day. We did do a lot in this National Defense Authorization Act. In addition to the CFIUS reform that I mentioned, we also prohibited the U.S. government from buying goods from Huawei and ZTE, two Chinese companies that are incredibly problematic from a counterintelligence perspective. We started to get at the influence of the Chinese Communist Party on U.S. campuses by limiting Pentagon dollars going to language programs from universities that have accepted Confucius Institute funding, as well as requiring any academics applying for Pentagon grants to disclose whether or not they've been part of a foreign talent recruitment program from China. And then there is, of course, the overall military rebuild. This will be the second year of it, which is important, right? Because because our hard power gives strength to our efforts to combat this.
Well, that's okay. I'm sorry to cut you. Fine.
Yeah.
That's all great. Thank you for saying that. But there's this foreign government lobbying that drives everyone crazy. I just think we've got to stop it. Anyway, sorry, no time for the others. Yeah, we're a bit out of time there. But up next, there is one big thing that could derail President Trump's booming economy. We'll tell you what it is after the break.